It's no secret that many major cities across the world are facing severe housing shortages, which are in turn making renting and buying property increasingly unaffordable. Looking at Australia, the median price of a house in Sydney has recently hit a staggering 1.65 million Australian dollars. In Perth, house prices rose by nearly 20% last year alone, and even in smaller cities like Wollongong or Coffs Harbour, locals are being priced out by rising housing costs. This trend isn't even limited to Australia. Major cities across the West, from London to San Francisco to Auckland, are also experiencing housing crises. However, there is at least one major city that's not following this trend, and it may have some lessons for other cities on how they can go about addressing housing affordability. The city in question is Melbourne. And now, before you all go write angry comments, I know housing in Melbourne is not exactly cheap, and its approach to housing has definitely been far from perfect. But despite this, out of all of Australia's capital cities, Melbourne is the only city to have its affordability metrics improve over the last 5 years. It offers the cheapest rental prices in the country, and if you want to buy property, the cost of a dwelling in Melbourne is 14% lower than the national capital city median, with only Hobart and Darwin offering lower prices. So, while I still wouldn't exactly call housing in Melbourne cheap, it is basically the most affordable major city in the country, and this has significant real-world implications, with Victoria now having the highest share of new loans going to first home buyers of any Australian state. The fact that Melbourne is relatively affordable is also kind of surprising. Depending on how you measure it, Melbourne is Australia's most populated city, and if you look at other countries, it's usually the case that the most populated city is also the most expensive. London, Paris, New York, and even nearby Auckland are all the most populated and priciest cities in their countries when it comes to housing. So one would expect Melbourne to follow the same trend. Looking closer to home, if we compare Melbourne with Sydney, which is a comparison I will be bringing up a few times in this video because both cities are quite similar in size but have very different levels of affordability, we can see that Sydney is significantly more expensive than Melbourne, even though Melbourne's population has been growing at a faster rate. So in this video, I'm going to be looking at how Melbourne has managed to keep its housing at least somewhat more affordable than its peers, what said peers can learn from this to improve their affordability, but also what steps Melbourne should take to make its housing even more affordable. Hi all, I'm City Moose and I make videos about urbanism and transport, so if that sounds interesting to you, consider subscribing to the channel. If you want to support the channel, I also have a Ko-fi, I'll put a link somewhere on screen, it's always appreciated. But now, back to the question of how Melbourne has managed to keep its housing more affordable than other similar cities. Well, Melbourne's relative success when it comes to this basically comes down to a few things, including innate stuff like its geography, as well as some good policy decisions. But the main reason is simple supply and demand. Now, the state of Victoria doesn't have that much control of the demand side of the equation, as it's the federal government that controls things like the immigration rate. But despite the high demand for housing, of all of Australia's cities, Melbourne has probably been doing the best when it comes to supply. According to the New South Wales Productivity Commission, that state has been lagging significantly behind Victoria when it comes to the construction of new housing, with New South Wales only building around 6 new dwellings for every 1,000 people each year, compared to around 8 to 9 in Victoria. One reason Victoria has been able to build so much more housing is the city's geography, where Sydney has a lot of natural barriers to growth, with national parks to its north and south, and an ocean to its east. Melbourne is far less constrained. This has all meant Sydney is only really able to sprawl westward, and it's sprawled so far already that with any new suburban developments you're looking at travel times of well over an hour to reach the city centre. In contrast, in Melbourne there's still lots of undeveloped land near places like Caroline Springs Station, where you can get a train to Southern Cross in under 30 minutes. Now, developing this land is just creating more urban sprawl, which isn't really ideal, although at least there's an opportunity for transit-oriented developments near these stations. But with that said, a lot of Melbourne's increase in housing stock has actually come from the city increasing its density. Again, if we compare the approaches in Sydney and Melbourne, 20 years ago Sydney was Australia's densest city, and that's still the case today, but the gap between the two cities has grown a lot smaller. In 2003, the list of Australia's 20 densest suburbs was dominated by Sydney, which held 16 spots on the list, while Melbourne just had 1. These days, Sydney still has the most with 13, but Melbourne now takes up 7 spots on the list, including the top 2, with the Melbourne CBD and South Bank taking the top spots. So while Sydney had a head start, Melbourne has simply been doing better at building new apartments, and the results speak for themselves, with some in the property industry warning that the city could see an oversupply of apartments, which could reduce their value. Now, that might not be what investors and developers want, but it sounds pretty good for first home buyers to me. But while the city has been densifying well in recent years, the Victorian state government is not stopping there and has recently unveiled various plans that would see even more housing and density built. These plans will see 50 or so existing suburbs designated as activity centres, where relaxed planning restrictions will allow for higher density housing to be built. These activity centres are centred around areas that already have good tram and train connections, and will allow for high-rise developments of around 10 to 20 stories to be built near the train or tram stops, with smaller low-rise apartment blocks or townhouses being prioritised as you move further out. The areas chosen for these activity centres, which you can see on this map, include some of Melbourne's wealthier inner suburbs that, despite being close to the city and having good transit options, have been punching below their weight when it comes to new housing. However, these activity centres are only one of Melbourne's attempts to boost housing density. Victorian Premier Jacinta Allan has called for Melbourne to become Australia's townhouse capital, and has released plans to allow property owners to turn their existing single-family homes into townhouses without the need for a permit. Personally, I'm quite a big fan of townhouses, as I think they strike a good balance between high-density apartments and low-density single-family homes. In fact, I have a whole separate video where I talk about why Australia needs to do more townhouse construction, so I'm pretty pleased to see this policy going ahead. Together, these policies should help provide a boost to Melbourne's supply of medium and high-density housing, and that will hopefully help keep prices relatively affordable. Now, while supply is a big part of the story, it's not all of it. As I'm sure many of you know, with policies like negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount, Australia provides some pretty big incentives to property investors, meaning wealthy existing landowners are encouraged to buy second, third, fourth, etc. properties, which then leaves far fewer options for first home buyers trying to get their foot on the ladder. Again, these are mostly federal policies, so they affect all Australian cities, but Victoria has made some efforts to combat them. In 2023, the state government increased the land tax rate and reduced its threshold. This tax only really applies to investment properties, so first home buyers or people with a single home weren't affected, but investors were. On top of all of that, the government also expanded the reach of the state's vacant land tax, as well as introduced a 7.5% levy on short-stay accommodation like Airbnbs. This has all contributed to Melbourne's property prices decreasing by around 3% in 2024 as investors sell up their properties to avoid these taxes. And while there was some scaremongering these taxes would result in higher rents because of fewer investment properties being rented out, the opposite seems to have happened, with average rents dropping by around 0.4% in the second half of that year. So ultimately, between policies that have strongly encouraged density and development, as well as policies that have discouraged hoarding investment properties, Melbourne has simply done a much better job at addressing its housing crisis than some other cities. But, of course, Melbourne is still not without its challenges. For starters, while apartments in the city have remained relatively affordable, the same cannot be said for houses, as we can see here where house prices have risen a lot faster over the past 2 decades when compared to apartments. Now, I do think cities like Melbourne need to densify, as the city does suffer from a lot of urban sprawl, so I'm not too opposed to younger people and first home buyers turning to apartments. But with that said, I do think the quality of apartments being built needs to increase. Even ignoring the all too common defects in a lot of Australia's new builds, these apartments are often simply not suitable for families. The vast majority of apartments being built only have between 1 and 2 bedrooms, and even in those, the rooms can be quite small. This may be fine for single working professionals or even couples, but households any larger than that will struggle. This leaves the only suitable housing for these types of households being the larger single-family homes, which are often just way too expensive. Hopefully, policies like the fast tracking of townhouse developments that I mentioned will help address this by filling in that gap between small but affordable apartments and large but expensive standalone houses. Another challenge Melbourne is set to face is a slowing rate of new home construction being felt across the country. The city has so far done somewhat well at keeping its supply up with demand, but if its rate of construction falls, this could change, so I hope to see governments stepping in to address this. Overall though, while their approach to solving their housing crisis might not be perfect, the proof is in the pudding. As I said, Melbourne is the only major city in the country whose affordability metrics have actually improved over the last 5 years. So then, what can Australia's other cities, as well as other major cities across the globe, learn from Melbourne? Well, for starters, they can learn supply and demand is a real economic principle, and applies to property just as much as it does to other goods and services. And while ideally you would address both the supply and the demand sides of the housing crisis, when the demand side is out of your hands, do what you can to make sure supply keeps up. This will mean building new housing and increasing the density of your existing well-connected suburbs. Another learning would be that you can ignore all of the scaremongering from investors on things like Airbnb and second property taxes. Because as we've seen in Melbourne, these things do actually work to bring down property prices. And no, despite what the investors may say, they won't cause rents to skyrocket. Personally, I think Victoria could go further with these taxes. The 7.5% levy on Airbnbs is a start, but New York recently implemented laws that saw the number of Airbnbs listed in the city drop by 85%. So if you're willing to go hard with these kinds of laws, you can get pretty good results. But even with these learnings, I still think more could be done. In Australia's case, while the Victorian government has done well to implement taxes that discourage property hoarding by investors, the federal government still offers investors tax breaks like negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts. Victoria has shown that reducing tax incentives for investors can work. So between these incentives and their control over the demand side of the equation, I think it's time the federal government did its part. On top of that, if more Australians are going to be living in apartments, the quality standards and size of these apartments needs to be improved. Apartments should be made a viable option for people wanting to raise a family, and defects in newer apartments are way more of a problem than they should be. Ultimately though, while not perfect, Melbourne is proof that a big and populous city can improve its affordability, even when housing costs in other similar cities have soared. And while I think there is still a lot more the city can do to become even more affordable, hopefully other cities around the world can start to follow its example. Well, as always, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, consider giving it a like and subscribing if you aren't already. If you want to support the channel, you can check out my Ko-fi, I always appreciate it. And if you want to find me elsewhere, my Instagram is @city.moose, and my Twitter/X is @city_moose1. I'm not really doing much with either account at the moment, but I may start soon. Now, with that said, I'm Kyle, aka City Moose, and as always, thanks for watching.